Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jason Mrochek, and I am the co-founder and executive director for the Patriot Coalition. And it's good to see everybody without their masks on. Let's start there. And I appreciate everyone taking time out of their probably more lazy schedules than the rest of the time to be on this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about some current events as they apply to constitutional principles and our spending. So the title of this presentation is called General Welfare and Federal Spending. So we're going to talk just about those things, right? So what the General Welfare Clause is in the Constitution, how it is supposed to be applied, and also how it has been used and abused historically to put us and our kids and grandkids in debt. So I'm actually going to, no disrespect, but I'm going to actually put everybody on mute so we can get through the material. But please don't hesitate to, if you're taking notes, just write some notes down, and we will have a Q&A after the fact. We'll go through, and if we have to, we'll back up through the slides, and I'll stay on as long as anybody has questions. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I will just share my screen here. Okay. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about what the current problem is with the use of the General Welfare Clause and its effects on our debt, our deficits, and really a runaway federal government. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of those in detail. First, we'll talk about our current situation, where we are in terms of our spending, our debt, and our deficit. We'll talk a little bit about the Constitution and some historical context when it comes to that. And then we'll talk a little bit about a solution to the problem. And then we'll, as I said, we'll follow up with some wrap up and questions. So the problem's a big one. When you consider the amount of money that we spend, our tax dollars, every single year on all sorts of unconstitutional programs, our future it looks dire from a fiscal standpoint. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about some definitions. So just to make sure everyone is on the same page and we're using the same definitions of words, the way that I'm going to use them, a deficit is the difference in any given fiscal year between the amount of money that we spend and the amount of money that we bring in revenues in our federal government. So it's a negative number, usually, and it describes that difference. The debt is the amount of accumulated deficits from each year. So, for example, if last year we had a $50 billion deficit and this year we have a $50 billion deficit, in total, our debt would be $100 billion. So the next one is unfunded liabilities. So these are programs and money that we owe for a specific statutory requirement that we have no idea how we're going to pay for them. We don't know where the source of revenue is or how much it's going to be and if it's going to be able to cover it. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about these unfunded liabilities. An example of that would be, let's say, Social Security. So in terms of spending, two different types of spending, the way the government looks at it, or at least two. The first is discretionary spending, and this is the categories of money that we can choose each year during the budget process, how much we want to spend in different programs. Mandatory spending, on the other hand, are requirements that we must spend a certain amount of money each year, and these are done through federal statutes. So in a past law or unconstitutional enactment in most cases, we will say that we are going to spend X money, let's say again on Social Security or Medicare. We don't know where that money is going to come from yet, but we say we are going to pay out that money. So that's a mandatory spending program, things that we don't have any discretion from year to year how much or if we're going to pay for those. And the last one is gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product, or GDP as we'll refer to it, is essentially the total sum of all of the products and services that are produced in a given year and the value of those products and services. So it's a huge number, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the debt and the deficit, where we stand, at least as of 2019. Those are the most recent figures I found that have been published. There are some current numbers that are more speculative, but we'll go with these for now. And these are straight out of the Office of Management and Budget. So what you're looking at here is a time graph from left to right until 2019. It doesn't say it, but the last bar is 2019. And the bars going up and down is the amount of deficit, or the amount of money that we have spent that we don't have each year. The line, the orange line from left to right, is the total amount of debt that we have accumulated over that period of time. So you'll see, at least as of 2019, we had roughly $1 trillion deficit, $1 trillion that we spent that we did not bring in revenue. And at the end of that year, fiscal year, we had a little over $1.6 trillion in debt, okay? That was total debt for not unfunded liabilities, but just structural debt. So now let's take a look at what that debt looks like compared to our GDP, or again, the amount of products and services that we produce each year. So again, this is a time graph from left to right. And the orange, or the bottom red line, is the amount of debt that we are accumulating each year. The gray line, and it's measured over here on this left side, the gray line is the gross domestic product. So again, we're still keeping ahead of ourselves for the most part. You know, we have a little over $20 trillion in gross domestic product, and we're closer to a little over 15 trillion in debt. But now if you look at the percent, this is the yellow line, the percent of debt compared to the GDP. So in other words, based on how much we're producing each year, how much do we owe? And you'll see that this line is creeping up to almost 80% as of 2019. Now you'll see a little bit later if you catch it, and I'll try to point it out to you. You'll see that we are actually exceeding 100% currently, and that's based on a lot of the spending that we've done over the last couple of years. So many of you may have already seen this, but there is a website out there called US Debt Clock, and it purports to accumulate and to show real-time changes to a lot of different metrics. The biggest one, of course, is the US national debt, right? And so here you'll see, as of this year, or this is maybe as of, I don't know, close to a week ago, US national debt sits at $23 trillion in structural debt. And what I mean by structural debt is the debt that we are budgeting for every year, doesn't include the unfunded liabilities that we talked about. So the scary part is, you can see, you know, if you look at every citizen in the United States, each of us, if we were to pay this off in an instant, would have to pay $71,000. Even scarier, next to that, is you'll see the debt per taxpayer, which is $190,000 per taxpayer. So obviously this tells you that, you know, a little close to half of the US citizens are paying taxes. And that if each of us were to try to pay that off, that's how much our burden would be as taxpayers. Down here at the bottom, I want to call your attention to this line here, in the red bar. You'll notice there, these are different liabilities than our national debt. These are some of the unfunded liabilities. So Social Security is at $20 trillion. Medicare liability currently sits at $31 trillion. And then you have this US unfunded liabilities sitting at $135 trillion. So this includes not only this Social Security liability part, but it also adds to that this Medicare liability. It adds our not our US national debt, but it also adds our federal debt that is held by the public. So these are treasuries and so forth, as well as any federal employee and veteran benefits. So all of those together sit at $135 trillion. And if you were to look at that in terms of how much we would have to burden to pay it off, it's $410,000 per citizen in the United States. So as I said, the scope of the problem is huge. So what's our current situation? Well, if you're a fan of Monopoly, you can see that we're broke or very close to it, right? With the numbers we're talking about, it won't take long. So let's take a step back and look at the 2019 fiscal year at a glance. In 2019, our budget that the president put forward and Congress passed was $4.5 trillion in spending. Alongside that, we had $3.6 trillion in revenue that we knew that we were going to bring in. So going into it, we knew that we are creating a budget with $1.1 trillion, which, again, if any of us decided that we were going to run our household finances that way, we wouldn't be around anymore, I'm sure. We would be destitute. We'd be trying to figure out what happened. But that's not the way our federal government works. So the question is, how do we pay for the deficit spending? And the answer is we either borrow it or we print it. Those are really the only two ways that we can get away from, in any given fiscal year, paying for those programs that we didn't have revenue for. So if we look at, still sticking with the 2019 fiscal year budget, you remember we talked about the definitions of discretionary, mandatory. Well, this shows a pie chart of the percentage of our budget that is either discretionary or mandatory. And of course, we also have to add in there the interest that we have to pay on the debt. You'll see, and this is alarming, 2/3 of our budget is what's called mandatory spending. And as you recall from the definition, this is money that we must spend by statute, at least by our statutes, that we don't have any control over from year to year. So when you hear about the budgeting process every year and we say, oh, we can't agree on a budget and we're going to have to furlough workers and we can't figure this out on our own in Congress, they only have access to change about 26% of our budget. A quarter of our budget's all they are arguing over. The rest of it, years ago, we put statutes in place that said we have to spend money on certain programs. So again, what are those programs that we don't have any control over today unless we were to repeal some laws or to change some laws? Well, the unfunded liabilities, Medicare and Medicaid. These are the largest budget items as of about a week ago. $1.2 trillion in Medicare, $1 trillion in Social Security. And then, of course, we have defense spending at a little under $700 billion. And our interest on the debt is about half of what we spend on defense spending. So again, pretty significant scope of the problem that we're facing. I just thought I'd throw this in here just to maybe tick you off a little bit more. So this is a kind of a chart of the top 10 programs with improper payments. And what do we mean by improper payments? That is a payment that is made by the government to the wrong person, in the wrong amount, or for the wrong reason. And if you scan through this list, you see Medicare, Medicaid, earned income tax credits, Medicare Advantage, National School Lunch Program, Housing Agency. Over the course of the last 13 years, as they've been able to identify these things, more than $1 trillion of our tax money has been spent with improper payments. I'll just let that sink in. Over $1 trillion of our tax dollars has been spent to the wrong person in the wrong amount or for the wrong reason. Okay, moving along. So here's some analysis I did about a half a year ago, 6 months or so, on a breakdown of the federal budget of the 2019 fiscal year budget. And what I did is I took those main three categories of spending, discretionary, mandatory, and net interest, over here in the red, and I broke that down by a determination of whether that spending was constitutional whether it was unconstitutional, and then I also had a couple categories for needs further review. And then once I figured out that I had accounted for the vast majority of the budget, I stopped. I didn't review the rest because it was chump change in comparison. So as you'll see, when you look at the constitutional spending versus unconstitutional spending, you will see that about 2/3 of our federal budget that we spend money on is unconstitutional spending. And so you're probably asking yourself, okay, well, what does that mean? How do you determine what is unconstitutional? And I'm glad you asked, and we're going to get into that. So hang on, and we'll discuss that here in a second. So this is where we get into the Constitution portion of the presentation. If any of you know me well, you know that this is what I love to study. This is what I like to talk about. This is what I took an oath to support and defend, as did many of you. And so it's important that this is our foundation for how we are running our government. And so this is why we're going to take a deeper dive into what the Constitution has to say about spending. So let's start with the preamble, because, and you'll hear at this point, you know, the title of this presentation has in part general welfare in it, which is the clause of the Constitution. It's there a couple times, that is used to justify a lot of the spending that we are doing as a nation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through where we see that phrase in the Constitution, and the historical context for how it got there, and then why and how it's being misused. So let's look at the preamble first of the Constitution. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So you see here, and I have it highlighted, this is the first time in the Constitution we see the phrase general welfare. And as you can see, there's nothing really specific about it. And you know, we even call it the preamble because it's giving a general sense for what we're attempting to do in this entire document. The next time you see that phrase is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which says, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States." So again, this is the only other place, this is the second time and the last time that you will see general welfare in the Constitution. And that is in, again, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. And we'll talk about it later, but this is essentially a heading or a label to what comes after it. So where does that term general welfare come from? Well, when I study the Constitution, what I like to do first and foremost is go back to the records of the Federal Convention. These are the only notes that we know of that have the debates of what the delegates to the convention talked about and argued over, and who was the first one to introduce certain language and what they had to say about it. So when I went back and studied this, this is in the, and the records are from several people's perspective. One of them is James Madison. There's a few other people who took notes and who are included in the compilation that we're looking at here. So, and it's done in date order, which is helpful. So what we find is on May 29th, 1787, Edmund Randolph was the first person to talk about how we're going to use the general welfare clause. And he said, quote, "Resolved," and this is in his resolution that he proposed. He says, "Resolved that the Articles of Confederation ought to be so corrected and enlarged as to accomplish the objects proposed by their institution, namely common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare." So he's referring back to the first attempt that we Americans had to try to constitute our nation in the Articles of Confederation. And so we're going to talk about here in a second, but notice that he says that the Articles of Confederation should be corrected and enlarged to made more grand, right? So now let's talk about a letter that James Madison wrote to Edmund Pendleton in 1792. So this is 4 years after we finished and ratified the Constitution. So it's still fresh in their minds, the delegates. He says, if Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote, you know what, I think I may have skipped a slide. Hang on a second. Nope, guess not. So Madison says, if Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one subject to particular exceptions. It is to be remarked that the phrase out of which this doctrine is elaborated is copied from the old Articles of Confederation, where it was always understood as nothing more than a general caption to the specified powers. So he's saying, look, we say general welfare, but why do we need to do anything else other than say general welfare if we can spend money on whatever it is that we think needs to be done? And then he goes on to clarify that we just took this phrase from the Articles of Confederation because it was a good caption to use to talk about what the specific enumerated powers pertain to. So let's look at the Articles of Confederation if we continue to kind of pull on that thread. In the Articles of Confederation, here's where it refers to the general welfare. It says, quote, the said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. And so this is in Article 3 of the Articles of Confederation. And so you see here, this is where they grabbed that phrase general welfare from. It was, again, in a very general sense, in almost a preamble, if you will. So next, we're going to look at a quote, again, from James Madison, largely considered to be the father and author of the Constitution, in Federalist 41. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Federalist Papers were written after the Constitution was written and before it was ratified by the states. And so these essays were a series of documents that were arguing on behalf of why the framers thought that we should the Constitution. And so in this essay, James Madison says, quote, for what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power? Nothing is more natural nor common than first to use a general phrase and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars. So he's saying here that, again, if we're going to use the term general power or general welfare, why do we need to enumerate unless that phrase, general welfare, simply is a label that is used to describe what we're going to enumerate? Okay, so now let's get into the meat of what the enumerated powers that are referred to by general welfare are. And so I have taken this from Article 1, Section 8, and this top here is Clause 1. We already talked about this a little bit. The Congress shall have the power to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. You'll notice I've color-coded the terms common defense and general welfare. And then down here, you'll see a listing of all the enumerated powers that fall under these general headings as Madison has been describing. So the header of general welfare applies to these enumerated powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8, and then there's several clauses beneath from 2 to about 18 that contain these enumerated powers. Collecting taxes, borrowing money, regulating commerce, how we naturalize people or adjudicate bankruptcies, how we coin money, punish counterfeiting, build post offices and roads, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, not that that's the subject of this presentation, but the other enumerated powers deal with the other general heading, which is common defense. And those are punishing piracy, declaring war, raising armies, maintaining navies, as well as calling forth militias and so forth. So you'll see that both of those very easily fit into the categories of the topics above. Okay, so let's look at another quote from James Madison. This is in one of his letters to Andrew Stevenson. He says, and this is in 1830, so admittedly, a fair amount of time has passed. But it says, it exceeds the possibility of belief that the known advocates in the convention for a jealous grant and cautious definition of federal powers should have silently permitted the introduction of words or phrases in a sense rendering fruitless the restrictions and definitions elaborated by them. So here again, he's emphasizing the fact that all those people who had just won their freedom at a high cost in the Revolutionary War and who were hell-bent on preventing a overarching powerful federal government who could run their lives, why on God's green earth would they suddenly just say, oh, general welfare means anything that you want? They were very, very protective of those federal powers and how much and what they can be used for. So this kind of sums up the arguments against using the General Welfare Clause as a catch-all to permit us to fund anything and everything under the sun. So the first question is, and we've talked about some of these throughout the presentation, why the need for an enlarged Constitution if the Articles of Confederation already had the phrase general welfare and it applied to letting them do whatever they thought was in the welfare of the people? It doesn't make sense. The second question here, why enumerate if they are intended as broad? So why are we going to enumerate powers if really the general welfare was talking about a general sense and a general welfare? There would be no need to do that. Why was there so much objection to the enumerated powers and not the General Welfare Clause? So during the debates in the Constitutional Convention, there was a lot of debate about the specific enumerated powers and what they should be limited to and who should have them and what manner are they allowed to be exercised. If they were so concerned about just allowing general welfare to mean anything they wanted, they wouldn't have those debates. And finally, why was there no objection in the Constitutional Convention, the subsequent ratifying debates, and the subsequent amendments to the term general welfare if it truly meant that they could do whatever they wanted? There was no argument over that. It was understood to mean just that, a label to describe the enumerated powers. Okay, so what is the solution? The Constitution is the solution. And that the House of Representatives actually tried to limit it. To their credit, back in I think it was 2009 or so, the 113th Congress, they instituted a new rule. There's House Rule 22, paragraph 7, subparagraph C, that said that all bills must cite as specifically as practicable the power or powers granted to Congress in the Constitution to enact the bill. So in other words, you have to tell us where you are getting the authority to pass this bill. So if any of you are researchers or you visit congress.gov a lot, what I've got here is a screen capture that shows their, at least on the House side, their attempts to ensure that they are citing as specifically as practicable what their authority is for those bills. So I've used here as an example because it's relevant and recent, the CARES Act. This was the most recent coronavirus stimulus boondoggle package that was passed. You'll notice if you search for HR 748 or any bill that is in the House, remember this is only on the House side, you will see on this right side, it says Constitutional Authority Statement. If you click that button or that link, it will pop up this window. And in this window, it will cite whatever the author of the bill, or more likely their staffers, cite as the authority to pass that bill. So in this one, you'll notice that for I don't even remember how big this bill was, trillion, 2 trillion, who knows at this point. They said that the authority that they had to pass this was Article 1, Section 8. Well, Article 1, Section 8 has about 18, 19 clauses in it. They listed it at the section level. So they didn't cite as specifically as practicable what authority they had to pass this bill. And for good reason, they didn't have one. So this is a listing. I just went back. These are the top three here. The last three appropriations, coronavirus supplemental boondoggles that we had. And what I did is I pulled the constitutional authority statement from each one. And I want to give you an idea, and you will see this for just about every bill that goes through Congress. Here's the one we just looked at. It cites Article 1, Section 8, which is the General Welfare Clause, or the whole section, actually. The one before that, this stimulus package, cited Clause 7 of Section 9 of Article 1 of the Constitution, which was that all expenditures must be by law. Well, okay, duh. But that doesn't tell you what authority you have to spend money on the specific things in the bill. But they also cite Clause 1 of Section 8 of Article 1, which again is the General Welfare Clause. They don't cite any of those, remember those enumerated, green enumerated powers underneath general welfare. They just cite the whole thing. In the stimulus bill before that, the same exact wording. It was actually done by the same author, which is why you see the same wording. They just copied and pasted. So they don't get specific about what authority they have to spend our money on those things. And then I threw a couple extra in here that this audience probably would appreciate. HR 5717, the Gun Violence Prevention, quote, Prevention and Community Safety Act of 2020. What do you know? Article 1, Section 8, the general welfare. They think it's in the general welfare of the people to legislate on whatever's in this bill. And then the USA Freedom Reauthorization Act of 2020 cites Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, and this is what you refer to as the necessary and proper clause. This is the clause that gives Congress authority to legislate on any of the items that precede it in those enumerated powers. So, for example, if it says post roads, this would give them the authority to legislate and probably hire contractors. It would allow them to hire surveyors, things that doesn't say hire a surveyor to build a post road, but the necessary and proper clause allows them some latitude in order to pursue those enumerated powers. But it isn't just a broad section in and of itself that gives anybody the right to legislate on anything. So what's the solution? Well, the Constitution is, but the Constitution has to be defended by people, and the people just have to say no. And many of us probably on this presentation, on this call or this presentation, online meeting, have taken an oath to support and defend. Every single one of the elected officials has. And so it is their obligation, it is their duty to say no when the Constitution is being violated for any purposes whatsoever. It could be small, it could be large. It could have very minimal impact, it could have a large impact. But they have to say no to unconstitutional provisions. They have to say no if they have the insufficient time to read the entire bill so they know what's in it. And they also have to begin repealing some of the bills that their predecessors should have said no to in the previous sessions of Congress. For example, all those mandatory spending items. We need to begin repealing some of those so they aren't mandatory, so that we have some control over our future, so we can say no in current years and not just continue to rubber stamp the spending that has been approved years and decades ago. Okay, so that wraps up the meat of the presentation. I put up here really quick, if any of you want to get in touch afterwards, privately, or just have follow-up questions. We're on the web, on email, and we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So you can record these if you'd like. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and looks like everyone's unmuted. Thanks, Bob. So if anybody has questions, you want to go over any of the material again, now's the time. Just speak up. Or if we don't, that's okay too. And you're welcome to contact me afterwards.
Hey, Jason, I just want to say excellent presentation. I always appreciate learning things I don't know. I think you've done a great job of kind of focusing on the misinterpretations of that general welfare clause and I think it's just real clear. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, hopefully it was valuable. Any other questions, feedback, comments?
Hey, Jason, this is Telvin. I'd like to echo what Bob said. Thank you very much. Very informative. I like the way you explained it. I mean, you made it very simple that we can understand it, and I do appreciate that.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, that's the intent, right? So some of this information too, right? It's incumbent upon all of us that care about the future of our nation. If this information was useful, by the way, if anybody wants to send me an email, some of you are in touch with me already. I'd be happy to share the slides for you to use. You can sit down one-on-one with people or have them handy when somebody says, well, we don't really have to say specifically why we can spend money. You can say, well, actually, that's not the case, right? So just let me know, and I'd be happy to send this presentation to you. Any other questions, comments, feedback, concerns?
So I guess this isn't so much a question for you as it is a question for us, but what's the call to action for us having this information now? What is it we ought to do, and what is it within our power to do, given that 2/3 of the federal budget is unconstitutional?
No, that's a great question. And actually, I probably should have covered that. My thoughts on that in that second to last slide. But it's incumbent upon us. If we are in touch, and we should be, with our federal legislators, we ought to be informing their discretion, as Thomas Jefferson put it, right? So we can be nice about it. We can say, hey, look, we don't have the authority to spend on that. Or more precisely, ask them where they think that they have the authority to spend on that. Any bill that they are in support of that is spending money, or any bill that they have already voted on. It would be interesting to hold them to account to say, where do you think you have the authority to do that? And be prepared for some tap dancing and humming and hawing. But we have to hold them accountable. And if they don't know, we have to educate them. And if they then are not responsive, then we have to start thinking about what are the next steps. If they're not responsive to the people, then it's incumbent upon us to find somebody who's going to be responsive, and who understands the threat and who is willing to do something about it. Any other thoughts on Bob's question about what else we can do?
Something I read this afternoon indicated that Madison took the position that general welfare, spending for general welfare, applied only to items that were otherwise authorized under the Constitution. Whereas Hamilton took the position general welfare meant just about anything Congress wanted it to mean. So that seems to be where the core argument was, and between what exactly does general welfare mean, and what did the writers of the Constitution mean by it? Were they referring to restricted rights, or it was just an open book, you can do anything you want? So in your presentation, you're kind of talking about the fact that it's been interpreted down through the years to be just anything they wanted to spend it on.
Yeah, that's correct. And I would, obviously you can see where my research has led me. And you'll take note that it was Madison, even though Hamilton was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, you'll notice that it was Madison who was the one that authored that subject about the spending and the general welfare.
Right.
Hamilton.
And for what it's worth, Hamilton got shot, right? So
ultimately, that is true.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? I noticed Nancy, Tom, Telvin, and Chris, you guys are on mute. If you had any questions, those questions aren't coming through unless you unmute yourself. Okay. Well, I sure appreciate everyone taking time and tuning in, and maybe learning something a little bit more about the way our government should run, and some steps that we should be taking. At a minimum, an understanding of what should be happening. And that's where it has to start, And before you can take action, you don't want to just go off half-cocked. You've got to have the information. And so now that we've got that, to Bob's great point, we have to start putting into action. So whether that's educating our peers, or whether that is taking it directly to our legislators, that's what we have to do. So
Do you think if you had gotten to Congress and would there have been a sufficient number of people that you could work with to start pulling back on some of these expenditures, and how would you have approached it?
yeah, well, I was pretty outspoken and got a lot of sneers for it, but there's a couple of things. One is, in accordance with our oath, we cannot, legislators or anybody cannot vote for something that is unconstitutional. It would be, that's not supporting and defending. You can't support and defend by violating, right? And you would be violating if you would vote for something, author something, promulgate, promote, whatever it happens to be. You can't do that if you've taken an oath to support and defend it. So one is you can't vote for unconstitutional spending, even if there's one item in there. It's one item, right? So one is they've got to say no. Another is you, as a legislator, you have to also, I mentioned one of the things that they've got to do is if they don't have time to read something, a lot of these things are, hundreds and thousands of pages that they're given 48 hours to read. No one's going to be able to do that. And so a commitment that I made when I was running for Congress was that if I don't have the time to fully read and digest a bill, I just will not vote for or against it, right? I will just vote present unless I read far enough where I find at least one unconstitutional item, in which then in that case, I know it's a no unless I can get an amendment to fix it. And I'm not going to just start amending a bill that I've read 3 pages into and it's, 1,300 pages, right? So you have to have the time. And so legislators have to have the backbone to say, look, I don't have the time to read this. And so I'm not going to take a position on it. The other thing that, a new, either a freshman or even 1 or 2 or a handful of people don't have a whole lot of authority on in Congress, whether they're in power or out of power, is to affect the appropriations process. Right now, that is done in a room probably with a handful of people. The speaker, the House Minority Leader, the President of the Senate, and then the Senate leader and his contemporary on the other side of the aisle. Those are the ones who are putting these packages together. Obviously, they're staffers, but they're not getting input, and the visibility is not there for the rest of the members of Congress to have any input and to make any changes or put the brakes on. And necessarily, I can see that they're doing this because there's so much that they want to pass in these bills, and that's part of the problem too. If we were back to single issue spending, where we're going to take the the defense budget, and we're going to only do that, and then we're going to do something on justice. We're going to spend money on that instead of putting them all together in one package. I think those are the things that legislators have to do at the federal level.
And the president should have line item veto.
So the question about line item veto, I didn't hear the first part of that. What was that? Something about line item veto. Anyways, so the line item veto is unconstitutional. I've gone back and studied that as well. So, the president doesn't have the line item veto, but he can veto a bill in its entirety and give comments on which sections of that bill he has issues with. And again, so the president's part of the process too. The president should be, in accordance with his oath, vetoing bills that have any unconstitutional spending on them, and then writing in which sections are unconstitutional and when and in what circumstances he could vote for that bill or approve it. I don't know if that answered the question on the line item veto.
I had an interesting discussion a while back on the line item veto, and the revelation that I got was that the danger in the line item veto is when you have, in the case of a chief executive from one party, a chamber of the Senate from the same party, and a chamber of Congress from one party, chamber of Congress from the other party. You get kind of that split Congress thing. And so what happens then is the president then takes the bill that's been sent over by Congress and lines through all the stuff that the majority wants and signs the stuff that the minority wants. And then what you have in essence is minority rule. And so that's the great danger of the line item veto that I hadn't thought through. But at the moment I went through that thought process, or I was led through it by Chris Betts, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I've now changed my mind 1,000%. That would be one of the most dangerous things that I could imagine.
Yep. Good point.
And that's the other part of a lot of these structural changes, right? We say these things in light of a current combination or a desired combination of control of the House, the Senate, and the executive, and we often don't think through, well, what happens when that changes, right? And I think that's how we get into some of these fixes. I think that's what happened with the 17th Amendment, right? We had a problem, and instead of addressing the problem, we went and changed the Constitution, and I believe to our detriment.
Yep. Agreed. Any other questions, comments?
Enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate again your time and joining the presentation. Hope you learned something and you can take away. As I said, send me a note if you'd like a copy of the slides, and we'll do some more of these in the future, different topics. But hopefully this has been beneficial. So thanks everybody, and have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Oh, crap. I don't think I recorded it.